Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Nick Ishmael Perkins, your host for today's webinar, and welcome to the fourth webinar in the Talk Back Better series, brought to you by the International Science Council in partnership with the Falling Walls International Year of Science Engagement Initiative. This series is part of the Public Value of Science program and came about in response to repeated calls by institutional members of the International Science Council to address the issues challenging effective research communication and evidence-based policy or indeed decision-making. Talk Back Better is derived from the oft-repeated call to build back better during the pandemic and is associated with the ambition to use the unprecedented crisis to transform our society in some way, whether this is to make it more resilient or indeed more equal. So with the panel of experts for the Public Value of Science program, we have identified some key themes that we think are critical for organized science to address if we are going to build capacity for scientific engagement in the current global context. This does not mean that we are suggesting science communication needs to be confrontational or even focused on verbal communication, though. And so today we will explore the issues of multi-institutional collaborations. Before I get into the substance of the discussion though, just a few bits of housekeeping. First, you may have noticed that today's session is being recorded, and this is important for us. Indeed, all of the previous webinars have been recorded, and you're welcome to view them. My colleagues will share them in the chat. Now, speaking of the chat, throughout the discussions today, we will post links at various points to resources that might be referenced, and I encourage you to follow and also to feel free to share any links that you think might be of interest or relevance during the discussion. You should also feel free to post your questions as we discuss the issues today, and at some point, we will take some time to take the questions that you post. Let us also know what part of the world you might be joining from. It's always helpful to know actually who is listening or watching us. I also want to take a moment to talk about the structure. So the webinar is going to last an hour and 15 minutes. We'll start with about 10 minutes of a sort of provocation, which provides an overview of the state of research and practice in this area. Then we have a flash talk where actually one of our guests will share their practice and what they have learned and what they would suggest that means for the sector. And then we will have about 45 to 50 minutes of a panel discussion where we reflect on what we've heard. Panelists will share a bit about their own experience and, of course, some practical tips to help you next Monday. And it's this point where we will take actually some questions from the chat. Now, on to the substance. Recent evidence indicates that most research communication is done through collaborative research programs, not institutions per se. This reveals a tension between institutional agendas and cross-institutional program strategies, and a potential gap in institutional policy and individual support. How do we navigate these tensions? And importantly, how do we maximize the opportunities, considering what we have learned about effective science communication? To begin our exploration of the issue, I would like to introduce Peter Weingart. As his Wikipedia page makes clear, he is one of the pillars of research in scientific communication. Professor Emeritus in Sociology and former director of the Institute of Science and Technology Studies in Bielefeld, and former South African Research Chair for Science Communication at Stellenbosch University. He is currently editor-in-chief of Minerva, the prestigious journal featuring sociological study of scientific knowledge. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Peter. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Let me start this short talk on trust and attention with an observation. All of you as academics know about ResearchGate and Academia Edu, two platforms which have actually captured or established a regime of attention management for, especially for researchers, for academics. And my claim is that this is a further step in the direction of the medialization of science. It is actually the ultimate triumph of the competition for the generalized attention of an undefined and indefinite public. And my claim is that this is actually foreign to science. Now, some 20 plus years ago, Michael Power published a book with the title The Audit Society Rituals of Verification, which is an analysis of the erosion of trust in institutions. The Audited Society reflects a tendency to invest not in trust, but in the trust in shallow rituals of verification, as it's called, at the expense of other forms of organizational intelligence. This replacement of trust in institutions to auditing processes comes at the price of unintended consequences, notably goal displacement on the level of scientist behavior. Now, this is actually pushed in universities by a reform movement that is also underway for more than 20 years, namely New Public Management. And New Public Management has forced universities across the globe into global networks of mutual observation, i.e. ranking systems. And these ranking systems have an inbuilt attraction to achieve public attention. This whole development is supported by a crisis of the traditional media business models, i.e. especially the print media business models. And this includes the erosion of the demarcation between editorial content and persuasive communication. This is between news and public relations, as well as the demise of journalists as gatekeepers and the rise of what Zuboff called, or actually Tim Wu called, the attention merchants. So far, the ultimate industry catering to the insatiable hunger for public attention. Now, what about this development? What about its effects on the institution that is devoted to communication of facts, i.e. the university? In other words, the crucial question is, what drives the central institution of science, the university, to vie for public attention, and what are the implications and possible effects for trust in science as the institution? We can all observe on the interactional level that scholars are using platforms like rankings or the counting of citations, etc., that have led to what is called the gamification of research activities, or what researchers have called and observed as the goal displacement. In other words, it has become more important than to publish an article than the actual content, to communicate the actual content. On the organizational level, we have observed the almost tenfold, or in many cases even more than tenfold growth of communication departments in university, communication units, I should say, not the departments, and the creation of PR and marketing and branding activities. If this goes on, the replacement of the sort of the systems logic of science, namely the pursuit of truth, i.e. the production of knowledge, will be replaced by capturing the attention of the general public. My claim is also that this capturing the attention of the general public is actually a self-referential process. It is an imagined public, i.e. Governments, politicians, and an undefined, unspecified public that is being captured. And the groups that are pursuing this, of course, have by now reached the status of an interest group in its own, i.e. PR and communication specialists. Their business is to apply the methods of communication, which are primarily designed to persuade, to convince, and to sell, just like commercial products or political parties. Now, there is collateral damage of this. And I'm going to give you just 3 examples. One is the discussion surrounding the University of Bern in Switzerland, University of Bern's guidelines regarding information and expression of opinion. This triggered a long discussion in the Swiss media, and it's exemplary of the conflict between communication interests of individual faculty and the management. A second example is the University of Heidelberg's blood test scandal in 2019. Here, the director of the gynecological clinic and a startup had announced a new test before going through the usual academic process of peer review and publication in a scientific journal. In this case, it was the attention-seeking scientists who staged the press conference against the warning of the PR unit. And a third case is the merger of the University of Tampere and UTA, i.e. the Temple University of Technology in the context of, and as part of the Finnish university reform and the establishment of a foundation university. That brought with it a neoliberal style management structure, and in this particular case, faculty and students protested against the de-democratization of the new communication strategies and ridiculed actually the branding on social media platforms, which ultimately then led to the dismissal of the director of communication. The lessons learned from this case, one stands out. Under the regime of competition for resources and public attention and the proximity to the media, the risk of the organization to fall prey to the strategies of questionable actors has increased considerably. The damage caused by these developments to the trust in the university as a core institution of science is hard to assess. So far, trust in science generally remains high, compared at least with other social institutions, and it may very well be that such an investigation, if it's being carried out, will reveal the self-referentiality and futility of the competition for attention. But my plea is that one should be warned that universities are ill-advised to sell themselves in the same way and with the same means commercial companies do. Obviously, there is no way back to the state of previous times, but it is necessary to rethink and redevelop organizational mechanisms that allow to preserve the integrity of science, while at the same time present a credible university to society. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think a very bracing and thoughtful critique of the current institutional context for many universities. And I can see how this is useful as we're thinking about the context in which institutional collaborations are taking place, about the stakes. You've been very clear about the issue of trust and its centrality to the practice of science, and also this idea of the gamification of research activities and the goal displacement, which incentives around communication with the public is a very common phenomenon. I just want to say very quickly that your reference to this imagined public was discussed at some length in the first webinar in the series about misconceptions around audiences, and for our participants on the webinar, feel free to reference that. There was an extended discussion around this particular issue. I want to now turn actually to a practitioner, admittedly a practitioner who's also done quite a lot of thinking and writing on the issue. Because the way that we've set these webinars up, of course, is that we try to get a balance of the discursive analysis and practice. And so we have a flash talk now from Liz Carlile, who has been the Director of Communications at the International Institute for Environment and Development for over 14 years. She's written a number of articles about communication strategy. She also happens to be a qualified performance coach and mediator. And indeed, I have seen her extraordinary emotional intelligence at work on several occasions. We have caught Liz at a particularly good time because she is days away from leaving IIED. And I'd like to think that this flash talk is a particularly reflective exit strategy. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you to Peter for a really interesting conversation that, issues that I certainly meet or bump into in different ways. So flash talk, I've got to be quick. As Nick said, I work in a think tank. I'm very practically running a central comms team. We do two things. We do institutional communication and engagement, and we do support to multidisciplinary, multi-collaboration projects in research. But we're applied research, worth remembering, not kind of deep, hard science. So much more, as Nick said, on the practitioner front. So my big first thing is, are we having the right conversation together? The institution, the researcher, the communicator. So I put together in 2011 a strategic framework that helps us get on the same page, because comms means different things to different people. And it's absolutely critical that we know the difference between whether we're wanting to build profile, whether we're wanting to share information, whether we're wanting to influence and engage around a research agenda, or whether we're wanting to connect to and mobilize communities. So that framework has helped me get on that same page and be able to open the conversation that remains open. And we've done that many times at the beginning of multi-collaborations, and it really helps to set the scene. Number two, is it the project or the institution who's doing the communication? And of course, you're right, there is massive tension here. There's tension around what the style of the communication is and what its purpose is. But certainly for me, in terms of building brand or legitimacy, it goes back to exactly the point that Peter made around the importance of trust, the essential nature of trust. And for our research teams to be credible and robust, they know what they need to do in their programs. They know how to deliver on extremely well researched work, but it's our job to convince people that our organization is legitimate, that its mission is relevant, that it is accountable to those who provide money. So there's a combination there between the two things. So that conversation, again, needs to continue and work together. So that's strategy, conversation, that's project or institution, combination of the two. Number three, audience. Good engagement is always and entirely about who you're trying to engage with. And researchers and research projects and the institution are engaging with different people and for different reasons. And understanding that together, talking together about what the approach should be taken to speak to different people, again, needs to be an open and continuous dialogue. And we work very closely with our research projects to understand who are the key stakeholders in that space and the kind of engagement and the nature of that we want to have take place. Number four is the supply and demand question. As a practitioner of communications, we know that if we want to have true engagement and we want to get an impact, we need to do it at the right moment for the people that we want to engage with. This is extremely complex and really demanding for research partnerships who have the, especially multi-collaborative ones, who have the complexity of running programs amongst many organizations and different researchers, and it can become very inward looking. And as institutional comms, it's up to us to work with researchers who know through their engagement in the sector they're working when the key moments of intervention might be, but we need to help them focus that on the demand for where the audience is listening and wanting that information, rather than getting bogged down in the inside workings. The fifth one, perhaps, is the enabling environment. And this has been the most challenging on lots of the multi-collaborations I've worked with. We've set up good strategic conversations about how we want to engage. We understand the theory of change. We're working together to engage the right people at the right time. But there's that really difficult time between the beginning of that and when people feel safe to share the findings. We developed in the comms team a sort of, I suppose we call it a research cycle that kind of shows us when the moments of intervention might be. And that looks at when people are preparing a project, when they have their early findings and are prepared to do some kind of discussion or dialogue, when they get their results and what kind of sharing of those results they want in particular places. I have got that, which I can share later. I won't do it now because I'm at 5:07, but those are my key points. I'll post a couple of links in the chat. Many thanks.
Thank you, Liz, for a very clear, concise presentation. Many things there to follow up on. I thought it was very helpful the way that you set out a kind of framework of trust that basically identified the role of institutional comms and the role of researchers in partnerships. And I am hoping that we'll get a chance to come back to that a bit and perhaps interrogate it. Also, very interesting reflections on the supply and demand question. And again, your articulation of the enabling framework, very interesting, lots of thoughts and questions for you. Again, hopefully we'll have time to come back to that. Now, we come to the bit where actually we're just going to have a bit of a chat, the panel discussion. And I want to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Marta Entradas, who is assistant professor at the University of Lisbon and a visiting scholar at London School of Economics and Political Science. She was also a Marie Curie Fellow, Fulbright Scholar, and she is the principal investigator on 2 projects looking at public communication of science at universities, which I'm sure she will talk about. She also happens to be a highly valued member of the Public Value of Science panel of experts. Welcome, Marta. And I'd like to introduce David Kornhauser, who is a director of global communications at Kyoto University. He has also worked in various media in Europe, Asia, North America, and is heading a couple of initiatives in Japan, which I am also hoping that he will talk about over the next 45 minutes. Welcome to you both. And I am going to invite Peter to join us as well for the panel discussion, and Liz. And Marta, let's start with you. Can you, I'm hoping that you will share with us some of the headlines from the study that you've done. I know you have a book coming out. Feel free to plug that. And I know you've just done a study in 6 countries, which is, I think, really very important because it speaks to a reality for many of us who are working in this space. But it would be interesting to hear a little bit about what those findings, a bit about them, just some headlines, and what that suggests about what you've just heard from Peter and Liz.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, a lot of the findings do really resonate with what Peter and Liz highlighted in their talks. I do actually coordinate 2 projects on institutional science communication. We are trying to understand the dynamics of science communication within the universities. So we look at the universities as a whole, a complex system with different levels of organization, with different levels of autonomy in these levels, different levels of power. And so I will highlight some of the findings that we have been coming up recently. There's some still to be published. I will share some of these findings here today with big pleasure. Well, one of the things that we see, and this happens at all levels of the organization, is actually a significant increase in public communication activity. A huge preoccupation in addressing society and, as Peter was mentioning, attention seeking. This happens at the central level and the central communication offices of the universities, but also at what we call the meso level, the research centers and the research institutes. And so in these structures, we see a lot of resources also increasing and being put into this what we call science communication effort. Also, the adoption of policies and guidelines are very frequent in institutions now. And we also observe something which we have called the decentralization hypothesis, which is this tendency to for science communication to happen at dispersed levels of the institution rather than the central communication offices, which seem to be busy with other communication functions, let's say, as Peter also mentioned in his talk. And so when we think about the university as a complex and whole system, we actually see different things happening at the different levels in terms of science communication, but also communication of the university more broadly. And one thing that we need to acknowledge, I think is important, is that the university as such a complex system has more than science communication, and we can't expect that science communication is all that institutions need to do now. And so what we have been finding is that, for example, at the central communication offices, what gets more visibility are activities such as branding, media relations, crisis communication. These professionals also engage themselves in producing university corporate communications, advertising the university events, managing the university website and the social media channels. So there's a pattern of communications happening at the central communication levels. And then we see at the subordinate levels, let's call the institute level, we see things more like organizing events about research. So the research type of communication seems to be emerging more at the meso level. So supporting researchers in the public engagement as well, although we also find these at the central levels because they actually connect themselves to organize bigger events and things like that. But facilitating community engagement as well, organizing events. So this all happens at this central level. And so it seems like that we find more, and as Peter was saying, these more instrumental goals at the central levels, which seems to be given more priority by institutions, and so they get more visibility. And so in a way, this is a little bit expectable because we do see universities as big structures with different missions, and education is a big part of it. And so when the central communication offices use like PR and marketing to attract students, I mean, it can't be knowing that students bring a lot of support to the institutions in terms of money. I mean, we can actually start to be considering how science communication and the other communication functions can come together and cope and be harmonized in a way that we respond and use different communication models to address different needs of the university. And finally, on the other hand, I think it's also extremely important to think about the public. And was mentioning before the imaginary publics. Maybe we have in mind that the public really wants to be engaged in the university communication, but is that really the case?
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, a lot there to think about. I really like the idea that actually it's a natural, this idea of looking at the different levels within the university structures, research structures. I want to say actually, Liz, because I know that Marta referenced explicitly universities quite a bit, but from my knowledge of think tanks, medium to large think tanks, it's very similar. Yes. But what you've described about actually thinking about different types of communication models to serve different functions and actually also sitting in different places in these institutions, I think that is quite interesting and something that's probably worth exploring. David, what are your thoughts as an opener?
Thanks, Nick. Thanks everybody for very stimulating questions. I'm very much on the practitioner level. The rubber is like rubbing against the road, and it's just asphalt everywhere. It's just really messy all the time. But I think the way I see our role as central comms for the university is being advocates for the researchers. I really feel that, and the researchers are under so much pressure. They're trying to get money. They're trying to get time. All these things are taken away from them, constantly. And so what I'm trying to do for them is be a voice for them where they need to be heard. And if that's within the institution, sometimes that's the most important thing. Like somebody's not listening to them. Or if for some reason there's just so many compartments that they're not really talking to the right person, I try to connect them. So that's internally. And then externally, it's with the media. If I know that somebody in the media wants to hear about something, I try to connect with the researcher there too, so that their voice is being heard in the right place. So that's really where I see my role. It's kind of advocacy, and there is the pressure from the institution, there are pressures from funding sources, from all sorts of other places to have their brand or whatever. But I often see that as being a hindrance and as being more of a burden on the researcher than a help. I mean, the researchers need the money, but there are just too many strings attached. So I try to help as much as I can to keep that away from the researchers so that they can focus on what they need to do.
I have to say that's a very compelling and very attractive vision, David. I'm going to put Peter on the spot and say, Peter, have you, in your experience, because you talk about the growth of this of the central comms and the infrastructure there, in your experience, what David is describing, is that what's happening? Or because you talk about goal displacement, which suggests that in fact it's the opposite, that somehow this communication agenda is actually not necessarily serving the interests of many researchers.
Well, yes and no. Of course, not every researcher is active on altmetrics, and not every researcher is interested in citation counts, et cetera, et cetera. There are still those who refrain from that. But what I'm of course, give me the credit of being of the older generation. So maybe it's outdated what I'm talking about, but I'm still worried about for instance, this morning, we get an article, a reviewer identifies and the author by saying, I got another article that I happened to read. This is salami slicing. This is happening so often now. And the members, especially the young scholars, are pressured into this. Of course, sooner or later, this becomes their reality. And then there is no, so to speak, no space to withdraw to anymore. That's what I'm worried about. I realize that universities today, and scholars as well, are living in a different world than, for instance, that I grew up in like 50 years ago when I started my career, or that was even longer. But anyway, that reality has changed. And so we have to be, scholars and university managements have to be aware of the fact that still all the surveys show, if science comes up connected to industry, to private interest, to politics, to politicians, they always lose trust. In other words, there is a public sentiment still alive that the institution of science is working to the good of the society, to the general, it's generally benevolent. And that should not be risked. And I think, and I mean, as much as I'm impressed by what Liz just told us about that activity, and I've had contacts with people in university communication units, same way, crisis communication makes perfect sense. I'm just worried that there is too little attention being paid to this potential loss of credibility and of trust when methods are becoming too sort of commercially oriented.
Okay, I think this is a fundamental question, and I'm going to ask actually all three of you to respond. So Liz, I'll give you a chance to respond first, and then I'll come to David. Sorry, and Mark.
My hand is diving up there. I mean, I think Peter, you're right. It's not a question of being the older generation, I mean, I think what's clear about how we communicate now is it's really challenging, it's really different. And people live in several kinds of worlds. And there is a pressure and an expectation to be in conversation, to be engaged, to be out there and to be visible. I think that's true. I think we have to continue to trust science, and we must, it's our duty to continue to trust science. So for me, what is important is that the research bodies and the people with the skills to communicate must talk together. They must find time to understand each other's strategies and to support each other and to build arenas of trust around who's doing what. A researcher has to be able to get to the detail. It has to be robust. It has to be legitimate and authentic. But we also have to, as communicators, build bridges into communities to hear those messages in the right way. And that needs a strong engagement, I think. And I'm not sure we get that, because the function of the university central comms is about, as you said, Marta, raising the profile of the organization, bringing in students and so on. We need something in the middle.
I mean, and interestingly, with research think tanks, I mean, a lot of it is we can substitute students for funding. Yeah. Really, you know, because this is, again, the mechanism works in a very similar way. David, are we spending enough time and energy designing for trust?
No, I don't believe so, really. It's partly just because we have so much research output that we're just dealing with on a daily basis, just to get that, push that through, that we don't generally have time to address larger issues, which is a fault of the institution. I've actually brought this up with some of our leadership, that we need to be talking about larger issues, the university and society, and especially issues of the past. I find that often these are just being sort of conveniently forgotten, or hoped to be conveniently forgotten. For example, Harvard recently committed an enormous amount of money to research on slavery in the past, as well as other institutions. And I brought this up in our institution because we have our own issues, not as old as slavery. And there's a lot of reluctance to do that. And I feel it really reflects on the reputation of the institution, whether the university is willing to look at itself, willing to be more introspective about problems that have occurred. And I'm referring specifically to World War II, to the World War II era with Japan. A lot of this is just very much pushed into the closet, and nobody wants to talk about it. So for me, that's just an example of something that's bigger, sort of a larger theme about how we're reacting to what's going on in society, or how we're reacting to how Japan is relating to other countries. And it's not, nobody wants to touch it. It's just, just do the press release for this paper. That's it.
I think this is fascinating, because I do think that we have to have this conversation. We need to talk also about issues around national polity and around institutional cultures. But I'm going to come back to that. And Marta, I'm going to turn to you on the issue of trust. But I want to, we have a question here from Vari. Hopefully I've not mispronounced her name. And she says, I fully believe to maximize impacts and increase reputation and trust, we need to value lived knowledge and experience as much as academic knowledge. Yet much of what is talked about is focuses on dissemination, which is important. But how do we include listening and give agency to non-academic research stakeholders in our strategies? And are public engagement professionals, rather than central communications departments, better placed to do this? So this is an elaboration of this challenge of trust and building trust.
That's for me.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just emphasize a little bit of what Liz mentioned about collaboration between different groups. I mean, it's extremely important if we think about the organization itself, and about what I was saying of this decentralized communication happening, dispersed in different structures of the university. There's obviously tensions that are going to emerge within the institution and who is doing what and with what resources. So it's extremely important that we start that conversation and understanding that there's the institution is complex and we need to put different groups into conversation, not only the communicators that work at the different levels and different structures, but also the scientists that integrate the research centers and the institution itself. And obviously, the public. We can't just pretend that we are an institution that is isolated and has nothing to do, and everything we want to show is actually show up research and findings and names of scientists. And I mean, that's much more than that we need to do. We need to stimulate this dialogue between the university and its diverse publics. Again, in what benefits the public, obviously, what the public has interest in contributing, for instance, but also on the side of the institution, what can be valuable. I mean, there's always this balance that we need to think about.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting is, again, you know, you come back to this idea that we need to disaggregate the institution and not think of it as a homogeneous block, but talking about it in terms of a site where there's systems, and sometimes there are contestations and so on, and so this idea of talking to each other, different parts, different sectors. I mean, I hesitate to say ecosystem because some people say the ecosystem doesn't acknowledge the power. But I hear where you're coming from. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I just want to make the following point. It was just, David just raised the issue. There are so many topics or issues that could be communicated. However, the question is, which topics are actually interesting to which public? That's the issue of stakeholders and so on. Now, all the communication, I mean, where it comes to very specialized communication to special stakeholders, no problem. I have no qualms with that. The issue is the general communication of, so to speak, where the university management has to decide, well, what are we going to communicate tomorrow? Or today, you know, and then you have this internal settlement of so many different research results could be communicated, but which one do you single out? That may trigger a fight between several scholars within the university. The management has to make a decision, et cetera, problems known. Now, who or which university institution used to be in charge of representing, so to speak, the public interest? Journalism. Journalism has the function to communicate according to its news values, that is, i.e. Novelty, but in science journalism, it's goes a little bit deeper. We know all that. Science journalism is practically, well, at the brink. It really is in trouble, and not least because this whole idea of management shifted from what used to be journalists to PR. Now, a colleague of mine, we had a working group in the Berlin Academy recently finished, and a colleague of mine who holds a chair in science journalism came up with the idea, and he said, well, what about if different organizations communicate on the same topic, on the same sort of research area, in order to communicate that to the public, and thereby possibly avoid institutional egotism. This would bring, so to speak, science communication to a more, shall we say, a more community-oriented level. The counter picture is this. we have studies now that show that the that the communication units of universities communicate to the media. The media have no longer an established or competent science journalism. Therefore, they tend to take that communication one by one, no strings attached, no criticism, no critical assessment, etc. That's a danger in itself.
Yes, Liz, I'll come to you, and then David. Yes. Mm-hmm. Get Liz.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Peter. And I would love to hear what David said. Sorry, I was leaping in because I got a bit excited. But I think there's a couple of things here. You know, this sense of competition, this sense of sort of having to grow your audiences, your students, does mean you've got to get the name recognition, you've got to flag the stars, you've got to get the big number. I get that, and I think that can happen. And I think we can recognize it for what it is. I think you're talking about something very fundamental here, Peter, and I think it's that. And David, I'd love your view on this. But you know, to what extent can university communications people allow the growth of a dialogue between researchers and journalists? Because I think researchers could actually grow back and nourish and nurture science journalism. But journalists don't want to be just fobbed off with the big line stuff unless they're in that position in their job. They want to understand the issues. They want to be involved. They want to have a long-term relationship on an issue because they too are experts in their own right. So again, we have different types of people doing different types of job. And I wonder if we could be more clever about that.
I mean, can I ask Liz first before David responds? I mean, how feasible does that feel for you with the researchers that you're dealing with at IIED?
So the challenge for us is kind of similar. We do need, because it's a competitive environment, we need to have a name check scenario. But I think what we have a better luck about is that our media officer, we have one, works directly with researchers, those researchers who want to have that media engagement. And it's a collaborative venture that says, let's understand the issue, let's stay engaged on the issue, let's pick our moments on the issue. It's not just about clapping IIED on the back. The intention is to get that issue out there in the right way and to understand it and grow it. So it sort of feels like it's sitting a bit in the middle.
Okay. And David, now I'm going to turn to you because I know that one of the initiatives that you're involved in speaks, I think, quite closely to this. So yes, what are your feelings on the feasibility and of this in the context you're operating?
Yeah, thanks. There are actually several different perspectives here. One is the international comms, which is very new in this environment. 10 years ago, most institutions just weren't doing very much at all. And there are a number of reasons for that that are specific to Japan. But myself and others at other institutions have been working very hard over the last decade or so to try to push things and try to improve the way that communications is being done. And also, as I was saying about advocacy for the researchers, this is a core kind of goal that we have. At the same time, the communication for domestic media is very different. And actually, it's kind of interesting because Japanese domestic media has been criticized a lot for sort of clubism, that there are press clubs, there are groups that sort of don't allow international journalists to join, these sorts of kind of Japan-only kind of problems. At the same time, I have been very fortunate to work very closely with our university's domestic press club. And the kind of interaction that we have with them is very collegial. There's no antagonism there about science topics. And so, unfortunately, the Japanese journalism, science journalism, has not been gutted quite in the same way that it has in the West yet. So there are still actual science journalists. This is a kind of an important feature here. So that's kind of one nice thing that we can rely on. Another is that when we put something out there, we can expect that the journalists will do what they're supposed to be doing, which is actually decide about how this fits in with other research, so that they're just not taking it piecemeal the way that Peter was saying. So this is a really kind of big difference that we see in putting things out domestically and putting things out internationally. But probably one very strange thing internationally is that Japanese institutions, when they put out research communication, collaborate on the press releases. And so the situation is actually almost as you were hoping, which is that the focus is on the science, and that the profiles of the individual institutions is lowered. It's partly a Japanese thing, just because there's a tendency to want to be forming a consensus rather than having certain people stick out. Also because the funding agencies often prefer that. They want to be involved too. So they want to have everybody kind of on the same level. And so we spent a lot of time with the domestic press releases having these negotiations about wording and about the order of commitments and the order of funding and so on, so that everything is fair and then everybody's happy with the content. So the kind of tussle and sort of look at me kind of attention grabbing, so on, doesn't really happen domestically that much, which is kind of good. At the same time, there are many aspects to this. It does kind of feed into a typical Japanese bureaucratic mentality of creating rules and sort of governance for media, which really isn't very realistic. So that they try to be very formulaic about how these processes happen. So we're in the middle. We're kind of doing both. We're doing domestic and international. And in a way, we try to see if we can incorporate the better parts of both to be more true to what the scientists are trying to say. So, Nick, your mic is off.
Yes, sorry, I just realized. You think I would learn that way now. So that's really interesting to me. But I know you've also been involved in some activities, some networking activities with peers in Japan. Do you want to say just a little bit about that quickly?
Yeah, sure. In part, it's because the international side is so new. So a lot of us at different institutions have been working with each other and sharing notes and gathering for meetings and so on. To educate ourselves, but also to share ideas about how we can be more effective in this, and also be fair. And a lot of issues have come up, very important issues, such as how to handle preprint science. And during COVID and so on, this has become a big issue. We also had some, as Peter mentioned about Heidelberg. Very similar situation at a university in Japan, some scientists trying to grab attention about COVID research before they had peer review. And so in terms of communicator networks, we try to get the word out about things like this and have some consensus across institutions about how to handle preprint or how to handle certain types of media. Another big issue are journals that are kind of sketchy, gray zone journals. So a lot of issues.
And was it easy to mobilize a network like that, to have that kind of peer-to-peer conversation?
It's not too hard because there's a lot of willingness and everybody kind of wants to learn. That's not too hard. But then there are also institutions where people just don't care. And they just say, don't bother me. I just want to, finish writing a press release and get it out. I don't want to talk about these sorts of things. So it's not everybody, but we do get a lot of involvement, which is good.
So Marta, David mentioned something just now, which I think is quite important, and it's worth us spending a little bit of time talking about, because David, you said that the funders expect this way of working. And I know one of the things, Marta, that featured in your research was about national policy around funding and the impact that that had on how research communication was practiced. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. So we've tried to understand a little bit about what drives institutions to do certain kinds of communications, and we looked at different factors that could influence these going public, let's say. And we look at things like whether the communication officers would make any difference. We look at the funding for the activities, for example, and we also looked, as you say very well, at the policies. And we look at different types of policies. We look at whether the country has a national policy, for example, and whether the institution has a science communication as a policy and as part of their missions and visions. And so what we found is that the policy is actually one of the strongest factors driving institutions to communicate about their research, as they say, right? And the national policy, although we find in the countries that we've looked, most countries don't have a national policy, but they have the drivers or guidelines. Let's say the UK has the Royal Society report, has the Lords of Science, Science and Society report, and so it's in my opinion, I think that having a national policy, even if it is a top-down approach, is actually a strong driver for institutions and for scientists to understand their role and responsibility, social responsibility in communicating their work. And that is indeed something that we find in the countries that have these national policies compared to countries that do not have a national policy. And it becomes like a force, let's say, that facilitates and kind of gives some obligation to institutions to respond. What they're doing, whether they are actually engaging and trying to get the public involved in the work they do and the research and the projects and designing and cooperations and co-productions and all that, we don't really know very well. But that is a drive, and that people say that they do and they respect what the country's national approaches are. That's actually true in the practices of institutions.
Interesting. Peter, yes.
Yeah, to support that, what used to be perhaps a benevolent idea, the democratization of science. STS people were communicating that. It's a kind of a, well, I should say a left idea, naive, and how did it go wrong? It was communicated then suddenly, or taken up by our science ministry, which by a minister who had very little other competence and interest, suddenly sort of found communication as her topic. And the result was a policy. She tried to get it. She didn't quite make it, but she tried to get it. A policy that would connect funding to communication. In other words, no funding without communication, or the other way around. South Africa has done the same thing. The NRF in South Africa has now decided, I have to be corrected by perhaps colleagues who are now listening, could put it in the chat, but I think it was 15% of funding has to be committed to public communication. Now, that in itself may not be wrong, but who knows how to communicate? Neither our science minister nor the South African NRF people know what impact that has on the institution. Turn history back a little bit and look at the introduction of rankings and citation counts and impact factors, and watch scientists, who are clever people usually, to spend time how to play the system. It's a disgrace.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I suppose this is always the thing, right? You have the policy, and then you realize that in fact it's fallible. There are implications that sometimes are not anticipated, and then you need to bring in some corrective measures. I know that actually in the UK, for the Department of International Development, Liz, it was 10% was the convention there. And Liz, I'd be interested to know, do you think that made a difference? I mean, Marta has already suggested that actually things like the report, the House of Lords report, was had a big impact.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes a difference. And I think the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, has made a big difference. But I think the challenge here for me is that the idea that we should share science and we should grow an appetite and an engagement with science is absolutely indisputable. I think knowledge is power, knowledge is about collective growth. Why wouldn't we do that? For me, what's the challenge is it's no good just slapping on targets onto researchers to say, you've got to have X number of articles, you've got to have X number of blogs, you've got to speak to X number of media people. That's not what's going to work, because the researcher's job is to stay focused on their work and to be able to do that. Yes, I believe their job is to recognize that communication should happen. And I believe it's to give communicators a bit more space to do their job and engage. And that's perhaps what I was trying to say earlier around having this strategic conversation that's clear about the roles for who does what and why. The challenge the communicators have is that they can't communicate without the content. They need the researchers to give the content, to ratify the content, to be happy, but it also needs researchers to say to communications people, we trust you to speak to that audience in this way. And that trust between those two groups, I think, is a bit flawed. But it comes from a flawed objective in a strategy that's a good strategy, I think. Mm. And I'm not an expert, by the way. This is just what I've seen and what I experience day to day in my research comms engagement.
Yeah. David, yes, in Japan, what's the situation in terms of that? Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned about that, Liz, because it's probably one of the biggest issues that we see is that a lot of the executives, a lot of the leadership think that they understand about communication. And most of them are scientists. Most of our leadership are not professional managers or anything. They've just worked their way up the ranks as researchers. And, okay, they've been department heads or something beforehand, before they reach the executive vice president level or whatever. But they're still more focused on their lives as researchers than they are on running the institution. And yet they see communication as just being a sort of a good news channel. It's like, oh, we did something good, here, tell everybody about it. And so we still face a very tough sort of uphill battle about convincing the leadership that there's a conversation that needs to be taking place and that it's two-way. And we have to be listening to what the media is saying and talking to them about how they're relaying science. So it's happening on many levels. And just a lot of lack of understanding is still a big issue. So that is really what needs to happen before that trust can be established that Peter mentioned.
Mm. I'm in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to ask you to think about some practical tips, as it were. So actually you have an audience here of researchers and research managers and administrators and so on. And, kind of what would you suggest they might want to take away. I have to share with you also a thought from Vary, who says that perhaps more funding needs to go into support for those who assist in communication. Could universities advocate for ring fencing, say 5 to 10% of the funding to central comms? And engagement support. So I guess the point here is that, okay, there's a blanket sort of, yes, 10, 15% goes to sort of research communication, but maybe actually there's space to nuance that a bit in terms of where that funding goes. And I think, and this goes back also to a point that Marta's raised, which is also really thinking about the kind of communication that you do, what's the model and also the objective around this. And I think, David, as you were speaking just now, the idea that actually thinking that institutional science communication, research communication should be really about trust facilitation is, I think, really quite a profound idea. So Liz, I'm going to start with you. I see you have your hand up. I'm hoping that in your response, you will also share 1 or 2 tips.
Okay. Well, I guess I just wanted to say back to Vary that, put like that, I think people, there would be uproar. I think researchers saying, I'm going to give another 5 to 10% of good research money to comms. We're not in that position yet. And that's because we haven't built that trust and because we haven't differentiated that strategy. I think if there was a conversation amongst university communications and researchers that said, okay, this portion is for PR, this portion is for really supporting the environment that nurtures good engagement around communication. You researchers don't have to do it all. Communicators can work with you. Sorry, that's just my response to that. I think that's a great idea, but we're on a journey to get there. My practical tip is always to just unwrap what comms means to the person I'm talking to, because most often you're in a conversation which is befuddled and confusing and obscure because it means so many different things to different people. And that for me is why the strategic framework has helped me so often to unwrap and move from there.
Thank you, Liz. And did you say you were going to share a link to that?
I did, and I have. It's the one, it's a publications, it's a 2011 briefing. Okay. I still feel it's relevant, even though I wrote it some time ago, and I still use it nearly all the time.
Thank you. And David, if you could, in about 60 seconds, that would be much appreciated.
Sure. My biggest motivation is to get good science out. And I try to be true to that. So, I get pressure to do something for the institution or for funders or whatever. But for me, it's about the science. That's the core. And if we stray away from that, we're not doing our job. So that's where I try to stay.
Okay. Thank you. And Marta, do you have some practical bits of inspiration for us?
Not sure if it's a bit of inspiration, but there is something that worries me and has been mentioned in this talk already, which is about what we actually communicate, what institutions communicate, what is chosen to be communicated, and who has the power to decide. Because one thing I do when I have, like, you were just saying, Nick, that there is a book of mine coming out, and when I try to talk to my university to advertise it and say a little bit about what was in the book, the only concern was actually where the book has been published and what was the title. I mean, there was nothing, no worry whatsoever about what the book was about. And I think that is a very serious issue that institutions need to think about, and that can be done in collaboration with the researchers and the science communicators and the leadership of the institution as well. Is actually to bring this understanding that communication is more than, attention seeking and self-promotion.
No, I hear that. And I think actually what's really interesting is that David has put his finger on the conundrum there, because actually there's a wariness about it, but actually it's also still seen as a very attractive drive. Peter.
My practical suggestion, or actually I have two. One is within the universities, a sharp separation between PR, which is mainly directed to students and to funders or to sponsors and so on, and communication proper. In other words, what scholars have to talk about, and that has to be subject to the rules of good scientific practice. And has to undergo the same kinds of checks and balances. Even better if it is a communication that is topic or project or program oriented, in other words, where the institutional interest is, so to speak, taken out. Second suggestion, support science media centers. The science media centers have done an excellent job. Good journalism, good science journalism, and that way the information that gets to the public is actually what the public deserves and what it should get. So those are my two takeaways.
Thank you, Peter, and I'm glad that somebody's mentioned science media centers. Bless them. Thank you to our panelists for, I think, what's been a really interesting, very stimulating discussion. And thanks to the audience for coming along and sharing their thoughts and questions. And of course, thanks to the team at ISC who have been providing technical support with the hosting. I look forward to seeing some of you next week, Thursday at the same time, where we're going to be talking about what works when it comes to capacity development for science communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.